Hello there, and welcome to the Silent Souls channel. Tonight, we'll be exploring the long, silent hallways and empty classrooms that hold secrets long after the final bell has rung. These are not stories of fiction, but echoes of real events, moments of unease that have settled into the very foundations of schools around the world. They remind us that sometimes the most familiar places can become stages for the deeply unsettling. If you find comfort in these gentle explorations of the mysterious, you're welcome to like and subscribe or share a thought in the comments below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, settle in. Let the certainty of the day slip away and allow yourself to listen to the whispers that linger in the dark. Let's begin. The silence of the hospital's fourth floor was a living thing. It was not the mere absence of sound, but a presence, a heavy, breathless entity that filled the spaces between the distant, mechanical beeps from the nurse's station and the soft, rhythmic sigh of the ventilation system. For Ilara, the night shift nurse, this silence was both a companion and a canvas. Upon it, the slightest deviation was painted in stark relief. A gasp, a rustle of sheets, the squeak of a shoe on linoleum. And tonight, as it had for 3 consecutive nights, the deviation was the same. The slow, rhythmic creak of a rocking chair from behind the closed door of room 304. Room 304 was empty. It had been empty for a week, since old Mr. Abernathy had been discharged, sent home with a new prescription and a firm handshake from Dr. Evans. The room had been terminally cleaned, its surfaces wiped down with harsh, citrus-scented disinfectant, its linens stripped and replaced with crisp, sterile whites. Yet every night since its vacancy, the rocking began. It started always at 2:17 a.m., as if triggered by some unseen clock, and continued until the first faint glow of dawn tinged the skyline outside the window. Ilara first noticed it on Monday. She had been charting medication dosages, her head bent over the cool glow of the computer screen, when the sound insinuated itself into her awareness. Creak. Pause. Creak. It was a patient, weary sound, the protest of old wood and tired joints. She had stood, her own joints complaining softly, and walked the short distance to 304. The door was shut. Through the narrow, wire-reinforced window, she saw only darkness and the vague outline of the empty bed. She pushed the door open, the silence rushing out to meet her. The room was still, the chair in the corner by the window perfectly motionless. The only scent was the astringent tang of cleaner. She wrote it off as a trick of the building's settling bones, an acoustic ghost carried through the ventilation from some other occupied room. On Tuesday, it happened again. Creak. Pause. Creak. This time she was not alone at the station. Liam, the young nursing assistant, looked up from his phone, his eyes wide. "You hear that?" he whispered, as if afraid the sound itself might hear him. Ilara merely nodded, her pen stilling in her hand. Together they approached the door. The sound was unmistakably coming from within. Liam, braver or perhaps more foolish, reached for the handle. "Probably just a draft," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. He swung the door open. The rocking stopped instantly. The room was, once again, empty and silent. The chair sat dormant. But this time Ilara noticed something else. A scent, faint but distinct, lay under the chemical smell of disinfectant. It was the sweet, floral aroma of lavender. "Smell that?" she asked Liam. He sniffed the air. "Just the stuff they clean with." "Why?" She didn't press it. "Must be the pipes," she said, her tone final, a professional dismissal of the irrational. But she didn't believe it. By Wednesday, the sound had become an expected part of the night's rhythm, a dissonant note in the hospital's nocturnal symphony. Ilara found herself watching the clock, dreading the approach of 2:17 a.m. When it came, right on schedule, she felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She didn't go to the door this time. She simply listened, her chart forgotten, as the rhythmic creaking painted a picture in her mind. An old woman, perhaps, wrapped in a shawl, rocking slowly and staring out at the sleeping city, keeping a vigil for a loved one who would never come. It was then that she decided to look into the history of the room. The hospital's digital records only went back so far, but there were older physical archives in the basement, a relic of a bygone administration that no one had yet had the heart to shred. During her lunch break, under the flickering fluorescent lights of the records room, surrounded by towering shelves of cardboard boxes smelling of dust and decaying paper, she began her search. Room 304 had seen countless patients come and go, but she was looking for a pattern, for a story that fit the sensory clues, the rocking, the lavender. She went back years, then decades. The names and ailments blurred together: broken hips, pneumonia, post-operative recovery. And then she found her, Agnes Millsworth, admitted in the autumn of 1978. The diagnosis was a failing heart, a slow and stubborn surrender. Her listed next of kin was blank. Under notes, in the spidery cursive of a nurse long retired, was a single poignant line: "No visitors. Patient often requests lavender sachet from personal effects. Sits and rocks by the window in the evening." Ilara stared at the faded ink. Agnes Millsworth had died in room 304 on a cold November morning. She had died alone. The following night, Thursday, the air in the hallway outside 304 felt thicker, charged with a new significance. Ilara was no longer just a nurse hearing a strange noise. She was an unwilling participant in a story that had begun decades before she was born. When 2:17 a.m. arrived, the creaking started again, but this time it felt different. It was no longer just a sound. It was a presence. It was Agnes. She was making her rounds, checking on Mr. Davison in 306, who was recovering from surgery and running a low-grade fever. He was restless, drifting in and out of a fitful sleep. As she adjusted his IV line, his eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever. "The lady in the hall," he murmured, his voice raspy. "She was just in here." Ilara's blood ran cold. "What lady, Mr. Davison?" "The old one. Smells like flowers." She put her hand on my head. He closed his eyes, a look of profound peace smoothing the lines of pain on his face. So cold. Felt nice. Ilara finished her task with trembling hands. She stepped back into the hallway and stood before the door to 304. The rocking continued, a steady metronome-like beat in the quiet night. She didn't open the door. She simply laid her palm flat against the cool wood, as if in greeting or in acknowledgement. "I know you're there, Agnes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's all right." For a moment the rocking paused. Then it started again, slower now, more peaceful. And as Ilara stood there, a wave of emotion washed over her. Not fear, but a deep, aching sorrow, mixed with a strange sense of comfort. It was the feeling of a story being heard after too long in silence. The vigil in room 304 was not one of menace, but of loneliness. A soul, waiting not to frighten, but to finally be seen, to have her presence acknowledged, so she could, perhaps, finally rest. The rocking continued until dawn, as it always did. But when Ilara passed the room on her way out that morning, she paused. The scent of lavender was gone, replaced once more by the stark scent of antiseptic. And for the first time, the silence behind the door of room 304 felt complete and utterly, peacefully empty. There is a hierarchy to the sounds of a hospital at night, a taxonomy of noises that define the landscape of the small hours. At the top are the urgent declarative sounds, the coded blare of an alarm, the swift rubber-soled rush of a rapid response team, the sharp clear call for medication. Beneath these are the steady, mechanical pulses, The rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, the pressurized hiss of oxygen, the hum of the refrigerator where pharmaceuticals are kept under lock and key. And below even these, forming the very substrate of the nocturnal world, is the silence. It is into this silence that the most disquieting sounds are born, not as intrusions, but as emergencies. The sound of the silent nurse was one of these. Her name, or the name the night staff had given her, was Eleanor. No one knew if that was her real name, but it suited her, evoking a sense of old-world grace and steadfast duty. She was never seen during the day. Her rounds began only after the last of the visiting hours stragglers had departed and the hospital settled into its true nocturnal self. Her signature was not a sight at first, but a sound. The soft, precise squeak of a shoe on linoleum. It was a sound that belonged to a different era. Modern nursing shoes were designed for stealth, made of soft, compliant materials that muted footsteps into near silence. But Eleanor's steps had a character to them. It was the sound of a hard leather sole, carefully polished, flexing against the floor with a gentle rhythmic protest. Squeak, step, squeak, step. It was the sound of unhurried purpose. Ben, a pragmatic and seasoned nurse with 20 years of nights under his belt, was the first to speak of her to Elara. It was during a shared coffee break in the dimly lit break room, the steam from their mugs curling towards the ceiling. "You'll hear her eventually," Ben said, his voice a low rumble. "Don't be alarmed. She's not malevolent." "Who?" Elara asked, though a part of her already knew, her mind flashing to the stories whispered by the newer aides. "The night nurse, the one who isn't on the roster." He took a slow sip. "She walks the long corridor on the surgical wing, the one with the old maternity suites they closed down for renovations. You'll hear her shoes, and if you're very quiet and you look from just the right angle, you might see her reflection in the glass of a closed office door." Elara felt a frisson of cold trace its way down her spine. "What does she want?" Ben shrugged, a gesture of profound acceptance. "To do her rounds, I suppose. Some say she was a nurse who worked here in the 40s, died of the flu that swept through the city, but was so dedicated she just kept coming to work. Others say she's a collective memory, the hospital's imprint of the ideal caregiver." He looked at her, his eyes tired but clear. "All I know is on the nights you hear her, the patients are calmer, especially the ones who are critical." It was another week before Elara experienced it for herself. She was tasked with covering a few hours in the surgical wing, a part of the hospital that was a maze of old and new architecture. The air there was different. It smelled older, of dust trapped in steam radiators and the faint, sweet and sour scent of ancient varnish. She was checking the IV of a post-op patient, Mr. Eddings, a man who had been restless and in considerable pain despite the steady drip of analgesics. His vitals were unstable, his blood pressure dipping worryingly low. She had just adjusted his dosage and was about to call the attending physician when she heard it. Squeak, step, squeak, step. The sound was coming from the hallway, slow and measured. It was not the hurried shuffle of a modern nurse, but a stately, deliberate pace. Elara froze, her hand still on the IV pump. The sound paused outside Mr. Eddings' door. Through the small window, she saw nothing but the empty, dimly lit hallway. Yet, the presence was palpable. It was a feeling of being assessed, of a calm, professional gaze sweeping over the room. She held her breath. The doorknob did not turn. The door did not open. But she saw Mr. Eddings, who had been moaning softly in his drugged sleep, suddenly still. His breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, deepened into a slow, regular rhythm. The tense lines of his face relaxed. On the monitor above his bed, the erratic spike of his blood pressure began to smooth out, the numbers steadily climbing back into a safe green range. The squeaking steps resumed, moving away down the hall. Ilara stood rooted to the spot for a full minute, listening as the sound faded into the silence from which it had come. When she finally dared to step into the hallway, it was empty. But the air where the steps had paused carried a faint, almost imperceptible scent of starch and carbolic soap. A clean, sharp, antiquated smell. From that night on, Ilara became aware of Eleanor in a way she hadn't been before. She learned to recognize the specific quality of the silence that preceded her rounds, a kind of hushed expectancy. She heard stories from other staff, always told in low, respectful tones. A young nursing assistant, nearly in tears from the stress of a crashing patient, swore she felt a cool, firm hand on her shoulder, steadying her, and when she turned, no one was there. But she caught the fleeting scent of soap and the fading echo of a leather sole. An elderly patient, confused and combative, was found sitting up in bed, calmly holding a one-sided conversation with an empty corner of the room. "Yes, ma'am," the patient had said. "Thank you, ma'am." When asked who they were talking to, the patient replied, "The nurse in the old-fashioned cap. She said my fever would break by morning." It did. The most compelling evidence, however, was in the patient charts. It became an unspoken rule among the night staff to never question the sudden, inexplicable stabilizations. A patient on the edge of septic shock would, for no discernible medical reason, see their fever break and their white cell count improve. A post-operative patient with uncontrollable nausea would suddenly find peace and rest. There was never a dramatic, miraculous recovery, only a quiet, firm hand on the scale, tilting the balance back towards life. The notes would simply read, "Patient resting comfortably, vitals stabilized." The unwritten addendum was always, "Eleanor was here." Ilara found herself drawn to the history, much as she had been with room 304. In the same dusty basement archives, she searched for a nurse who might have matched the description. The records from the 1940s were sparse, but she found a group photograph from 1943. Rows of women in crisp white dresses and stiff, winged caps stared solemnly back at the camera. Her eyes were drawn to one woman in the back row. She was not smiling. Her gaze was direct, calm, and held a depth of responsibility that seemed to transcend the decades. The caption listed her as Eleanor Vance, head nurse, surgical ward. There was no further record of her fate. One night, the hospital was in chaos. A multi-vehicle accident on the freeway had flooded the ER, and the shockwaves reverberated throughout the building. Every alarm seemed to be ringing at once. The night was a blur of running, of shouted orders, of blood and urgency. Ilara was assisting in the ICU, where two of the most critical patients were fighting for their lives. One, a young woman, was coding. The team worked with frantic, precise energy, a whirlwind of controlled panic. But the young woman's heart refused to respond. Amidst the cacophony, the flatline whine of the monitor, the doctor's commands, the compressed hiss of the ambubag, Ilara heard it. A single, soft, leathery squeak from the corner of the room. She looked up. For a fraction of a second, she saw her. Not a reflection, not a shadow, but a full, solid form. A woman in a pristine, old-fashioned nurse's uniform, her cap perched perfectly on her head. Her hands were clasped calmly in front of her. Her face was the one from the photograph, serene and watchful. She wasn't looking at the machinery or the doctors, she was looking at the young woman on the bed. Her expression was not one of medical curiosity, but of profound, infinite compassion. And then she was gone. She was. At that exact moment, the flat line on the monitor stuttered, a single blip, then another. "We have a rhythm," the doctor yelled. "Sinus rhythm." The team redoubled their efforts, and this time the patient responded. The crisis passed. The young woman would live. Later, as the dawn began to bleach the darkness from the sky, Ilara walked the now quiet hallway of the surgical wing. She was exhausted, her body aching, but her mind was clear. She stopped at the spot where she had seen Eleanor. The air was still. There was no scent of soap, no sound of footsteps. She understood now. Eleanor was not a ghost in the traditional haunted sense. She was a pattern, a persistent echo of compassion that had been woven so deeply into the fabric of the hospital that it could not fade. In moments of extreme duress, when the chaos threatened to overwhelm the healing, her pattern reasserted itself. She was the embodiment of a nurse's first and last duty: to bear witness, to offer a steadying presence, to tilt the balance, however slightly, towards hope. The silent nurse did not walk her rounds to haunt the living. She walked them to ensure that the fundamental promise of this place, a place of healing, was never entirely broken. And in the deep, quiet hours of the night, that was a comfort far greater than any fear. Every hospital has its heart of anxious stillness, a place where time distorts and the air grows thick with unspoken prayers. This is the family waiting room, especially the one on the surgical floor. By day, it is a landscape of worn upholstery, discarded coffee cups, and the low murmur of television news that no one truly watches. By night, it becomes a confessional of shadows, a place where hope and dread sit side by side in uncomfortable chairs, waiting for a verdict to be delivered by a tired-faced surgeon. It was in this room that Ilara first saw the man. She was making her rounds, offering a word of encouragement to a family awaiting news on a complex bypass surgery. The room was typically full, a knot of people clinging to each other, their postures etched with fatigue. But in the far corner, in a high-backed chair that was always slightly in shadow, sat a man alone. He was dressed in a style that seemed out of place, a neat but outdated brown tweed suit, with a fedora hat resting on his knee. His hands were folded in his lap, and he was perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the double doors that led to the operating theatre corridors. What struck Ilara was the depth of his patience. While the families around him fidgeted, sighed, and checked their phones compulsively, he was a statue of serene waiting. He had no phone, no book, no coffee. He simply waited. Assuming he was a relative who preferred solitude, she approached him. "Can I get you anything? Some water?" The surgeon should be out within the hour to speak with the Martinez family. The man slowly turned his head. His face was kind, lined with age, but his eyes were what held her. They were old eyes, filled with a profound and timeless sorrow, but also with an infinite patience. He offered a small, sad smile. "No, thank you," he said, his voice soft and cultured, with a faint, old-fashioned accent she couldn't place. "I'm just waiting for news." "Of course," Ilara said. "I'll be at the station if you need anything." She continued her duties, but something about the man lingered in her mind. An hour later, when the surgeon emerged to give the Martinez family the good news that their father was in recovery, the room erupted in quiet sobs of relief. As the family hugged and gathered their things to go to the ICU, Ilara glanced to the corner. The man was still there, still waiting. The empty room seemed to amplify his solitude. The next night, she saw him again. It was a different surgery, a different family. But there he was, in the same chair, wearing the same suit, the same hat on his knee. He was waiting. She felt a cold trickle of unease. This was no relative. No one waited like that, night after night, for different patients. She began to ask discreet questions. The day staff had never seen him. The security cameras, when reviewed, showed the waiting room emptying and filling, but the corner chair where he sat was always blurry, indistinct. The night cleaners knew of him, though. They called him the regular. They said he was harmless, a part of the furniture. They would vacuum around his feet, and he would sometimes look up and thank them, his voice always polite, before returning to his vigil. The breakthrough came not from records, but from a patient. An elderly woman, Mrs. Gable, was recovering from a successful gallbladder surgery. She was lucid and chatty, and when Ilara mentioned the quiet man in the waiting room, described his old-fashioned suit, the woman's face softened with a memory. "Arthur," she whispered. "That sounds like Arthur." "Arthur? Arthur Milligan," Mrs. Gable said. "It was a long time ago before you were born, dear. My first husband, John, he was in a terrible accident, a construction site collapse. They brought him here. The surgery, it took hours. I was in that waiting room all alone, just a wreck. And there was a man just like you described. He sat in the corner, so calm. He didn't say much, but his presence, it was a comfort. When the doctor finally came out, his face told me everything before he spoke. John was gone. Tears welled in the old woman's eyes. I broke down. I just collapsed right there on that horrible linoleum floor, and that man, Arthur, he was suddenly beside me. He helped me up, sat me down, and he just patted my hand. His hands were so cold. He said, "I am so sorry for your loss, Clara." He knew my name. I was too grief-stricken to question it. He stayed with me until my brother arrived. I looked away for one moment to wave my brother over, and when I looked back, Arthur was gone. I always meant to thank him. Such a gentleman in my darkest hour. Ilara's research in the archives confirmed it. John Milligan had died on the operating table on November 5th, 1961. There was no record of an Arthur Milligan as a relative, but in a box of old staff photos, she found a picture of the hospital's board of directors from 1959. And there, in the back row, was the man. The same kind, sorrowful eyes. The caption read, "Arthur P. Walsh, hospital benefactor." She dug deeper. Arthur Walsh had been a wealthy, childless widower who had donated a significant sum to the hospital's founding. His own wife, Eleanor, had died during a botched emergency surgery at a poorly equipped clinic years before. His philanthropy was born from that tragedy, a desperate attempt to ensure others would not suffer as he had. He had become a constant, quiet presence at the hospital, visiting patients, offering comfort. And then, in the winter of 1961, he himself had passed away from a sudden heart attack. The records noted he was found in his study, a newspaper on his lap. The date of his death was November 4th, 1961, the day before John Milligan died. The pieces clicked into place with a heartbreaking clarity. Arthur Walsh, the man who had built this sanctuary of healing, had died just before John Milligan was wheeled into its operating theater. And in death, his mission of comfort had not ended. He had become the hospital's eternal sentinel of solace. He was not waiting for news of a living patient. He was waiting for the newly bereaved. He was there to catch them when the world fell out from under them, to offer the steadying hand he wished someone had been there to offer him all those years ago. That night, Ilara saw him again. The waiting room was tense. A young wife was awaiting news on her husband, a victim of a car accident. She was alone, trembling, her face pale. And there, in the corner, was Arthur. He wasn't looking at the operating room doors anymore. He was watching the young woman, his expression filled with a deep, prepared compassion. Ilara didn't interfere. She watched from the nurse's station as the surgeon finally emerged, his shoulders slumped. She saw him approach the young wife, kneel before her, and speak the words that shatter lives. The woman's knees buckled. A silent scream contorted her face, and Arthur was there. He was beside her in an instant, a solid presence in the swirling chaos of her grief. He didn't speak. He simply offered his arm, a gentleman from another time, and guided her gently back to a chair. He sat with her as she wept, a silent, steadfast anchor in the storm. He was still sitting there, a comforting shadow, when Ilara finally had to turn away, her own vision blurred with tears. She understood now. The last visitor was not a ghost haunting the waiting room. He was its caretaker. He was the final, unwavering piece of the hospital's promise, that even in the face of its ultimate failure, no one would have to endure that terrible, defining moment of loss alone. He was the living memory of the hospital's founding compassion, a love so strong it had outlasted even the heartbeat of the man who bore it. And as long as there was grief in these walls, Arthur Walsh would be there, in his tweed suit and his fedora, waiting in the corner, forever ready to offer a cold, comforting hand. In the grand mechanical symphony of the hospital, the elevators were the steady, reliable bass notes. They were utilitarian beasts, sheathed in stainless steel, their doors scarred by the countless impacts of gurneys, food carts, and medication trolleys. Their movement was a constant, a vertical circulation system that was the lifeblood of the building, ferrying staff, patients, and the grim necessary tools of medicine from the bright public spaces of the lobby to the silent specialized realms of the upper floors. Most of them were unremarkable, their journeys predictable, their destinations clearly lit on the brushed metal panels inside. But there was one, Elevator C, stationed in the oldest part of the building, the East Wing, that was different. It was known among the night staff in hushed and careful tones as the elevator that sometimes traveled to another floor. Elevator C was a relic. While the other elevators had been modernized with smooth, silent hydraulics and digital displays, Elevator C still operated with a system of clattering gears and groaning cables. Its interior was a time capsule, walls paneled in a dark veneered wood that was chipped at the corners, a floor of scuffed black linoleum, and a control panel featuring an array of actual physical buttons, their numbers worn away to vague, golden ghosts. The light inside was a dim, yellowish glow from a single caged bulb in the ceiling, casting long, shifting shadows. It smelled of old oil, ozone, and something else. Something faintly metallic and dry, like static electricity and dust. The anomaly was this. The elevator only had buttons for floors 1 through 8. The East Wing itself only had 8 floors. Yet, on rare, unpredictable occasions, when the elevator was called, its doors would open with their usual shuddering sigh, and the panel inside would illuminate a 9th button. It was not labeled with a number, but with a simple, stark symbol, a black circle. It was not always there. Most nights the panel was normal, but sometimes when the conditions were right or wrong, the black circle would appear, nestled between the 8 and the door close button. Ilara's first encounter with it was entirely accidental. It was her 3rd month on the night shift, and she was covering for a colleague in the East Wing, a part of the hospital she usually avoided. It had a different atmosphere. The air was cooler, the lighting more subdued. The patterns on the linoleum floor were older, more intricate and faded. She was returning from delivering a stat lab result to the hematology department on the 6th floor. The hour was late, past 3 a.m., the quietest point of the night. She pressed the call button for the elevator, her mind already on the paperwork waiting for her at the station. The familiar groan and clank announced Elevator C's arrival. The doors slid open, revealing the dim, wood-paneled interior. She stepped inside, turning to face the doors as was habit, and pressed the button for the 3rd floor. It was only as the doors were sliding shut that she glanced at the panel. And there it was, the black circle. It was lit from within by a soft, amber light, looking like a pupilless eye staring back at her. A cold jolt, entirely different from normal fatigue, shot through her. She had never seen it before, but she had heard the stories. "Don't press it," the seasoned staff would say. "Just get off. Let the doors close. It's a glitch." But her finger, acting on an impulse she didn't understand, was already moving. It wasn't curiosity, not exactly. It was a feeling of inevitability, as if the elevator itself had chosen her for this journey. Her finger pressed the black circle. The effect was immediate. The normal, familiar sounds of the elevator's machinery ceased. The gentle vibration through the floor stopped. For a moment, there was absolute, profound silence. A void of sound so complete it felt like pressure on the eardrums. Then, with a lurch that made her grab the wooden handrail, the elevator began to move. But it didn't move up or down. It moved sideways. It was a disorienting, nauseating sensation, a sliding, grating motion that defied all logic of physics and architecture. The single light bulb flickered, dimmed, and then went out, plunging her into utter blackness. The journey felt both instantaneous and eternal. In the darkness, her other senses heightened to a painful degree. The smell changed. The scent of oil and ozone was overpowered by a new, chilling aroma, the cloying sweetness of decayed flowers and the sharp, acrid tang of old chemical disinfectants, something like formaldehyde and carbolic acid mixed together. The air grew cold, so cold she could see her own breath forming pale plumes in the absolute black. And she heard something, a faint, rhythmic sound from beyond the walls of the elevator. It was the sound of typing. The steady, clacking strike of an old-fashioned typewriter, and beneath it, a low, monotonous hum of machinery she couldn't identify. Then, as suddenly as it began, the lateral motion stopped. The elevator settled with a final, shuddering clang. The light bulb sputtered back to life, its dim glow now seeming unbearably bright. There was a moment of dead silence, broken only by the frantic hammering of her own heart. Then, the doors began to slide open. They did not open onto a hallway. They opened onto darkness. Not the clean, empty dark of a power outage, but a thick, velvety blackness that seemed to absorb the elevator's feeble light. The air that washed in was frigid and carried that same sweet, rotten chemical smell, now so strong it made her eyes water. Her own breath was a frantic white cloud. Peering out, her knuckles white on the handrail, she could just make out the outlines of a corridor. It was narrow, with walls of dark, painted brick. The floor was bare concrete. A few yards away, a single bare bulb hung from a wire, casting a small, jaundiced pool of light on the floor. In that pool of light stood a metal cart, the kind used for medical instruments. It was laden with objects she couldn't quite discern, but their silhouettes were strange and unsettling, glass jars, coiled tubing, and tools with long, cruel-looking handles. And then she saw the door. It was at the very edge of the light, a heavy, windowless door made of dark wood with a large, tarnished brass handle. Set into the wall beside it was a small, glass-fronted cabinet. Inside, illuminated by a single tiny bulb, was an old-fashioned telephone, the candlestick type, its receiver hanging limply from its hook. As she watched, frozen in terror, the telephone rang. The sound was shrill and metallic, a jarring, insistent bell that shattered the oppressive silence. It was not the gentle digital chirp of a modern phone, but a harsh, mechanical clatter that seemed to vibrate through the floor and into her bones. It rang once, twice, 3 times. A part of her, the trained nurse, screamed at her to stay put, to press the door close button, to retreat back to the world of fluorescence and beeping monitors. But another, deeper part, a part captivated by the sheer, impossible reality of the moment, was compelled to answer. It was a call. And in a hospital, a call is rarely ignored. She took a step forward, her shoes making no sound on the concrete. She stepped out of the elevator and into the freezing air. The darkness seemed to press in on her, alive and watchful. She walked the few steps to the cabinet, her hand trembling as she reached for the small hinged door. The ringing stopped the moment her fingers touched the cool glass. She lifted the heavy receiver, the cord coiling like a dead snake, and brought it to her ear. There was no voice on the other end. There was only a sound, a wet, ragged, and desperate breathing. It was the sound of someone or something in the final, agonizing throes of suffocation. Each inhalation was a painful, whistling gasp, each exhalation a wet rattle. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated suffering, a sound that spoke of lungs filling with fluid, of a body drowning from the inside out. Ilara stood there, paralyzed. the horrible symphony of suffering playing directly into her ear. She tried to speak, to say, "Hello," but her throat was locked shut. The breathing continued, growing slightly fainter, as if the source were moving away. And then, from the darkness down the corridor, beyond the circle of light, she heard a new sound. A soft, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled slowly across the concrete. It was accompanied by a low, guttural moan. That broke the spell. She slammed the receiver back onto its hook, the sound a sharp, final crack in the silence. She turned and lunged back into the elevator, her body moving on pure adrenaline. She hammered the door close button with a closed fist. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The doors remained open, the dark corridor waiting. Then, with agonizing slowness, they began to slide shut. As the two panels of steel met, cutting off her view of that terrible place, she caught one last glimpse. The heavy wooden door at the end of the hall was now slightly ajar, and from the crack of darkness within, a single pale and skeletal hand emerged, its fingers slowly curling around the doorframe. The doors sealed with a definitive thud. The sideways journey began again, the same disorienting slide through the darkness, the same flickering light. When the elevator finally jolted to a stop and the doors opened, she was staring into the familiar, brightly lit and utterly mundane hallway of the third floor. The air was warm, smelling of coffee and floor wax. The distant sound of a telemetry monitor beeped a steady, comforting rhythm. She stumbled out, her legs weak, and leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. A passing custodian gave her a curious look. "You all right, nurse? You look like you've seen a ghost." Ilara could only nod, unable to form words. She looked back at elevator C. The doors were closed, the call button dark. The panel beside it showed it was resting on the first floor. The black circle was gone. She never spoke of the incident to anyone but Ben, the senior nurse. He listened gravely, without surprise. "You found the sanatorium floor," he said quietly, when she had finished her frantic, hushed account in the break room. "The what?" "This building," he explained, "was built on the foundation of the Old City Pest House, the isolation hospital from the early 1900s. They tore most of it down, but the foundations, the sub-basements, they were incorporated, sealed off, but never destroyed. Elevator C, they say, is the only thing that still has a connection, a mechanical memory. That black circle button, it's a ghost in the machine. It doesn't take you to a place that exists on any blueprint. It takes you back to the tuberculosis wards, the diphtheria rooms, a place of quarantine and terminal care, a place without hope, where the only treatment was isolation and waiting for the end." "The breathing," Ilara whispered, the sound still echoing in her mind. "The sound of a TB ward," Ben said, his face grim. "They called it the death rattle, and the dragging sound. Probably a gurney. They didn't have the manpower to carry all the bodies out with ceremony." From that night on, Ilara gave Elevator C a wide berth. She would walk the extra minutes to use the banks in the new wing. But she watched it, and she saw others, usually new interns or night shift workers who hadn't been warned, step inside when the black circle was lit. She would see the doors close, and a minute or two later, they would open again on the same floor. The person who emerged would always have the same look on their face, a shell-shocked, pale visage of someone whose understanding of the world had been fundamentally fractured. They never pressed the button again. The elevator was a wound in the fabric of the hospital, a fleeting physical bridge to a past so saturated with misery that it had refused to fade away entirely. It was a reminder that this place of healing was built upon a graveyard of forgotten suffering, and that sometimes the building itself remembers. And in the deepest, quietest hours of the night, it sometimes offers a terrible sideways glance into the memory it can never quite erase. There is a particular quality to the silence of a children's ward after dark. It is not the profound, waiting silence of the surgical floors, nor the exhausted, breath-held silence of the ICU. It is a silence that feels incomplete, a blanket thrown over something still fidgeting, still whispering, still very much alive. The air itself seems to hold the echoes of the day's vibrant energy, the squeak of toy wheels, the high-pitched chatter, the occasional wail of frustration or pain. When night falls, and the last parent is gently ushered out, when the main lights are dimmed to a soft, golden glow, that energy does not simply vanish. It retreats. It settles into the corners, under the beds, behind the brightly painted murals of cartoon animals, and it waits. For Ilara, being assigned to the night shift on the pediatrics wing, known as the Sunshine Ward, was always a mix of tenderness and trepidation. During the day, it was the loudest, most colorful, and most emotionally demanding part of the hospital. At night, it became its most mysterious. The rules of reality, she had learned, were softer here, more permeable. Children, with their uncluttered perception of the world, seemed to be able to see and interact with things that adults had long since learned to ignore, and sometimes it seemed those things interacted back. The ward was laid out in a wide, horseshoe-shaped corridor. At its center was a large, circular nurses' station, a fortress of paperwork and medication carts. Radiating out from it were the patient rooms, each door decorated with a cheerful, interchangeable sun. But at the far end of the western wing, the hallway ended at a set of double doors, sealed with a heavy-duty lock and a bright yellow sign that read, "Renovations in progress. Strictly no entry." This was the old isolation wing, closed for over a year for a much-delayed modernization. It was from behind these doors that the first sound usually came. It was never loud. It was the faint, melodic ripple of a child's laughter. It was sound that seemed to travel not through the air, but through the bones of the building itself, a vibration that you felt in your teeth before you heard it with your ears. It was utterly devoid of malice, a pure, crystalline expression of joy, and that was precisely what made it so chilling. It was laughter with no visible source, echoing in a place that was supposed to be empty. Ilara first heard it on her third night rotation in pediatrics. She was restocking a blanket warmer, her back to the sealed doors, when the sound trickled out. It wasn't a single child. It was the layered, overlapping laughter of several, a ghostly playground. She froze, a warm fleece blanket clutched in her hands. The sound lasted for perhaps 5 seconds, then cut off as abruptly as if a switch had been flipped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was now heavy, listening. She turned slowly. The hallway was empty. The double doors were shut, the lock untouched. From the rooms around her, she could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of sleeping children, the occasional snuffle or sigh. Nothing more. "Did you hear that?" a small voice asked. Ilara jumped. A little girl named Chloe, no more than 6, was standing in the doorway of her room, clutching a worn, stuffed rabbit. She was a chemo patient, her head bald and delicate, her eyes enormous in her pale face. "Hear what, sweetie?" Ilara asked, her voice carefully neutral. "The kids," Chloe said, pointing a thin finger towards the sealed doors. "They're playing tag. They're always playing tag after lights out." A cold knot tightened in Ilara's stomach. "What kids, honey? There's no one over there. That part of the hospital is closed." Chloe looked at her with a patience that was far too old for her years. "Not for them, it isn't." She then turned and padded back to her bed, leaving Ilara alone in the hallway, with the silence and the lingering, imaginary echo of laughter. This became the pattern. The laughter would come, usually once a night, always from the sealed wing. The children who were awake and alert would often comment on it, not with fear, but with a simple, matter-of-fact acceptance. To them, the night kids were just a part of the hospital's ecosystem, as normal as the nurses who brought them juice or the doctors who listened to their hearts. Then came the footprints. It was Liam, the nursing assistant, who discovered them first. He came to find Ilara, his face a mask of confusion and unease. "Ilara, you gotta see this." He led her to the polished linoleum floor in front of the sealed double doors. There, in the thin film of moisture left by the night's cleaning crew, was a set of small, bare footprints. They were child-sized, smudged and partial, as if someone had been dancing or shuffling in place. They started a few feet from the doors and ended abruptly in the middle of the hallway, going nowhere. "The cleaners?" Ilara asked, though she knew the answer. Liam shook his head. "They use those big buffing machines. These are fresh. And look," he pointed. "They only go one way. They come out of the doors, but they don't go back in." Ilara stared at the footprints, a primal fear stirring in her gut. It was one thing to hear a disembodied sound. It was another to see physical evidence of a presence. She fetched a disinfectant wipe and knelt down, erasing the small, ghostly impressions from the floor. But the next night, they were back. And the night after that. Always in the same spot, always facing out into the hall. The phenomenon began to evolve. The laughter continued, but now it was sometimes accompanied by the soft, shuffling sound of small, quick footsteps in the hallway. Ilara would spin around, certain she would see a child out of bed, but the corridor would be empty. Once, she saw the shadow of a small, running figure dart across the wall at the far end of the hall, cast by no visible source of light. The most intimate and disturbing encounter, however, was the hand. It happened during a particularly bad night. A young boy named Leo, who had undergone a difficult spinal surgery, was in severe pain. His IV pain medication wasn't touching it, and he was crying, a hoarse, desperate sound that tore at Ilara's heart. She was in his room, trying to comfort him, her hand on his forehead, speaking to him in low, soothing tones. His parents had just stepped out for a much-needed coffee, and she felt the full weight of his suffering. "Shh, Leo, it's okay. The medicine will start working soon, I promise." But he was beyond listening, his small body rigid with agony. Ilara felt a surge of helplessness. She was about to call for a stronger order when she felt it. A sudden, distinct sensation of a small, cold hand slipping into her own. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked down. Her hand, the one not on Leo's forehead, was hanging by her side, and it was undeniably, unmistakably being held. The pressure was light, but firm. The skin felt cool and smooth, like polished stone. She could feel the slight weight of it, the tiny individual fingers curled around her own. She did not pull away. A strange calm washed over her, cutting through her panic. She looked at Leo. His crying was subsiding into hiccuping sobs. His clenched fists were relaxing. His eyes, screwed shut in pain, fluttered open. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the space beside her. "The little girl," he whispered, his voice ragged. "She says it's going to stop hurting now." And as quickly as it had come, the cold, small hand was gone. The sensation vanished, leaving her own hand feeling strangely warm and empty. At the same time, Leo let out a long, shuddering sigh. The tension drained from his body, and his eyes closed in genuine, peaceful sleep. When Ilara checked his monitors, his heart rate had slowed to a steady, normal rhythm, and his blood oxygen levels had improved. She stood there for a long time, staring at her own hand. There was no mark, no residual cold, but the memory of the touch was seared into her nerves. It had not been a frightening experience. It had been comforting, a shared burden. Driven by a need to understand, Ilara once again found herself descending into the hospital archives. The pediatrics wing was one of the oldest parts of the building, and its history was long, and she suspected, often sorrowful. She requested the records for the old isolation wing, the part now sealed behind the double doors. The files were thick and smelled of slow decay. The isolation wing had been used for decades to contain infectious diseases. She read through reports of measles outbreaks, whooping cough, and most notably, the polio epidemics of the 1940s and 50s. Page after page of names, dates of admission, and dates of discharge. So many of the discharge dates were followed by a single stark word: deceased. Her heart ached for these long-ago children, confined to these rooms, separated from their families, many of them never leaving. She imagined the fear, the loneliness, the interrupted lives. And then she found a ledger from the 1950s that included not just medical notes, but occasional comments from the nursing staff. Next to the name of a 7-year-old girl named Sarah Miller, who had succumbed to polio, a nurse had written, "A sweet child, always laughing." Even at the end, she spoke of the friends she played with in the halls at night. Another note for a boy named Thomas Jacobs read, "Passed peacefully. Said a little girl with cold hands was waiting to take him to play." Ilara closed the ledger, her eyes stinging. She understood now. The laughter, the footprints, the cold hand. They weren't manifestations of hauntings in the traditional terrifying sense. They were echoes. The children from the isolation ward, those who had spent their final days and nights in those rooms, had formed their own community. In their loneliness, they had created a world of play that transcended the walls of their rooms, and perhaps the walls of life itself. And that world, that community, had persisted. They were still here, bound to the place of their greatest suffering and their final camaraderie. They weren't trying to frighten the living. They were, in their own way, continuing their vigil. They reached out to the new children, the ones who were scared and in pain, and offered them the only comfort they knew. The promise of a friend in the dark, a playmate to share the long, lonely night. The next time Ilara heard the laughter from behind the sealed doors, she didn't feel a chill of fear. She felt a profound, aching sorrow, mixed with a sense of reverence. She was working at the nurse's station when the sound began, that familiar, melodic ripple. She looked up and saw Chloe, the little girl from the first night, standing in her doorway again. She was smiling. "They're laughing because Billy finally caught Anna," Chloe reported, as if providing a sports update. "He said it took forever." Ilara smiled back, a genuine, soft smile. "Tell them I'm glad for him." Chloe nodded seriously and disappeared back into her room. From that night on, Ilara's relationship with the Sunshine Ward changed. The phenomena didn't stop. The laughter still came, the footprints still appeared, and on rare, difficult nights, she would sometimes feel that familiar, cool clasp in her hand, a silent offer of support from a nurse who had been on the job far longer than she had. But the fear was gone, replaced by a solemn sense of guardianship. She was not just caring for the children in the beds. She was, in a way, bearing witness to the ones who lingered in the shadows, the eternal playmates of the pediatric wing. The children's ward after dark was not a place of horror. It was a place where the line between the present and the past was blurred by innocence. It was a sanctuary where the laughter of ghosts was not a mockery of life, but a stubborn, beautiful insistence that no child, not even one trapped in the amber of memory, should ever have to be alone. And in the deep, quiet hours of the night, that was a truth more powerful than any fear. In the lexicon of hospital sounds, there is one that stands apart, a sound that instantly vaporizes the mundane and replaces it with pure, undiluted urgency. It is the sound of a code blue. It is not a single sound, but a cascade, a piercing overhead alarm that cuts through all other noise, followed by the frantic staccato beat of running footsteps, the rattling thunder of a crash cart being propelled at speed, and the sharp, clear voices calling out orders, a litany of life and death procedures. It is the sound of a body in rebellion, a heart in stasis, a brain being starved of oxygen. It is a battle cry against the inevitable. For the staff, it is a drill they train for endlessly, a scenario they face with grim frequency. The sound triggers a physiological response, a spike of adrenaline, a tightening of the muscles, a hyper-focus that blocks out everything but the patient and the protocol. It is exhausting, terrifying, and vital. But there is another code blue at St. Jude's, one that does not appear on any schedule, one for which no crash cart is ever dispatched. The staff call it the Phantom Code. Ilara first experienced it during a quiet, rainy Tuesday night. She was in the middle of a tedious inventory check in a supply closet on the 4th floor, counting boxes of gauze, her mind lulled by the rhythmic patter against the window. The silence was soft, almost warm. Then it was shattered. The code blue alarm blared through the overhead speakers, a harsh electronic shriek that seemed to vibrate the very walls. It was followed by the location. Code blue, room 418. Code blue, room 418. Ilara dropped her clipboard, the sound clattering unnaturally loud. Room 418 was just down the hall. Her training took over. She burst out of the closet and sprinted towards the room, her own heart hammering a frantic echo of the alarm. As she ran, she saw other doors fly open. Liam emerged from another room, his eyes wide. A doctor she recognized as Dr. Evans was already rounding the corner at a full run, his white coat flapping behind him. The rhythmic, approaching thunder of the crash cart echoed from the nearby elevator bank. They converged on room 418 simultaneously. Dr. Evans shoved the door open. The room was empty, not just patient empty. It was pristine. The bed was made with tight military corners, the sheets crisp and white. The bedside table was clear. The monitors were dark, their screens blank and dusty. The room had been vacant for days, awaiting a deep clean. For a moment they all stood in the doorway, panting, confused. The alarm was still blaring overhead. Code blue, room 418. System glitch? Liam ventured, his voice thin. Dr. Evans, his brow furrowed, keyed his radio. Central, confirm code blue, 4th floor, room 418. We are on scene. Room is unoccupied. Over. The response crackled back almost instantly. Central to Dr. Evans, we show no active codes on the 4th floor. Repeat, no active codes. System is clear. As if on cue, the alarm cut off. The silence that rushed back in was profound, heavy with confusion and a lingering psychic aftershock. The sound of the crash cart, which had been growing louder, now also stopped. The team pushing it arrived, their faces expectant, then baffled as they took in the empty room. It sounded so real, Ilara said, her voice barely a whisper. The adrenaline was still coursing through her, a chemical fire with no outlet. Her hands were trembling. Auditory hallucination, Dr. Evans stated, his tone firm, clinical, as if trying to diagnose them all. Mass stress-induced hysteria. It happens. But he didn't meet their eyes. He turned and walked away, his shoulders stiffer than when he had arrived. The incident was logged as a system malfunction and largely forgotten by the day shift. But for the night staff, it was different. Ben found Ilara later at the nurse's station, still looking pale. "Your first phantom code?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded. "You've heard it?" "Everyone who works nights long enough does. It's always room 418. Why 418? Ben leaned against the counter, his gaze distant. It wasn't always a patient room. Back in the 70s, it was a small 4-bed cardiac observation unit. They consolidated it into the larger ICU in the 80s. But on the night of November 12, 1978, they had a full house. 4 patients, all critical. A power surge from a storm outside fried the old monitoring system. The nurses on duty didn't realize all 4 patients were coding at the same time until it was far, far too late. By the time they manually checked, they lost every one of them. Ilara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. All four? All four, Ben confirmed. The story goes that the charge nurse that night, a woman named Rosemary, hit the code blue button again and again, but the system was dead. She just stood there pounding on the silent alarm while her patients died around her. They say the sound of that failed alarm, the urgency of that moment, it got stuck, like a record skip in the fabric of this place. So now, sometimes, it plays back. The next occurrence was a month later. This time, Ilara was not alone. She was at the central station with 2 other nurses when the alarm screamed to life. Code blue, room 418. The same electronic shriek, the same urgent digital voice. They all looked at each other. No one moved. Are we just not going? One of them, a new girl named Anya, asked, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and professional guilt. It's not real. The other nurse, Maria, said firmly, though her knuckles were white where she gripped the counter. It's the ghost in the machine. If you run, you just feel like an idiot in an empty room. So they stayed. They endured the 90-second alarm, the sound of phantom footsteps running past the station, the distant frantic yelling of voices that had no source. It was an agony of inaction. Every instinct, every ounce of their training screamed at them to move, to help. To sit and do nothing felt like a profound violation of their oath. When the alarm cut off, the silence was suffocating. The third time, Ilara decided to do something different. She was in the east wing when the alarm sounded. Code blue, room 418. Instead of running towards it or away from it, she began to walk slowly, quietly, down the long corridor that led to the room. She moved like a ghost herself, her soft-soled shoes making no sound. As she approached, she saw it. The door to 418 was closed, but from the narrow window she saw a flicker of movement. She pressed herself against the wall beside the doorframe, her heart thudding, and dared to peek inside. The room was not empty. It was lit with a dim, yellowish light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. The bed was occupied by a gaunt, elderly man, his mouth open, his eyes staring at the ceiling. A woman in a stark, white 1970s-era nurse's uniform, her cap pinned neatly to her hair, was leaning over him, her hands performing frantic chest compressions. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. Around her, other spectral figures in period-specific scrubs moved in a silent, desperate ballet, adjusting a non-existent IV, holding a ghostly ambu bag, their faces masks of concentrated panic. It was a silent film of a tragedy, projected onto the present. Ilara watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the spectral nurse, Rosemary she presumed, stopped compressions and looked up, her face a portrait of anguish. She reached for a button on the wall, pounding on it again and again. Ilara could see the strain in her arm, the desperation in her eyes, but the room remained utterly silent, save for the very real, very present electronic alarm still blaring through the hospital's speakers. Then, the nurse at the bedside turned her head. She looked directly at Ilara. Their eyes met across time, across the veil of life and death. There was no malice in the ghost's gaze, only a profound, bottomless plea. It was the look of a caregiver who had failed, who was forever trapped in the moment of her greatest powerlessness. She was not trying to frighten anyone. She was still calling for help, a help that was 60 years too late. The alarm cut off. In the instant of returning silence, the vision in room 418 vanished. The room was once again dark, empty and still. Ilara slid down the wall to sit on the floor, her legs unable to hold her. She understood now. The phantom code was not a malicious haunting. It was a trapped echo of trauma, a moment of collective professional failure so potent it had scarred the very atmosphere. The building was not haunted by the dead patients, but by the living staff who had been forced to stand by and watch them die. They were reliving their worst moment for eternity, and the modern hospital's alarm system was, for reasons unknown, somehow tuned to their frequency, occasionally broadcasting their silent scream across the decades. After that, Ilara's relationship with the phantom code changed. When it sounded, she no longer felt fear or frustration. She felt a deep, aching sorrow. She would stop whatever she was doing, close her eyes for a moment, and send a silent thought down the hall towards room 418. "I hear you. I'm sorry. You can rest now." It didn't stop the phenomenon. The alarm still blared on random nights, a ghost in the wires, a memory that refused to be erased. But for Ilara, it became a somber reminder. It was a memorial, not in stone, but in sound. A tribute to the nurses and doctors who had come before, who had faced impossible odds and heartbreaking loss, and whose dedication was so absolute that even in death, they could not stop trying to answer the call. In the world of the living, the code blue is a summons to fight death. In the quiet halls of St. Jude's after dark, the phantom code is the sound of a battle that was lost long ago, still being fought in the echoes. An eternal testament to the weight of a promise that, once made, can never truly be broken. The intensive care unit exists in a state of perpetual, fragile tension. It is a frontier, a liminal space where the battlefield of the body is mapped onto screens by dancing lines and digital numbers. Here, life is not simply lived. It is monitored, measured, and supported. Breath by mechanical breath, heartbeat by regulated heartbeat. The air hums with the low-grade electricity of hope and dread, a scent of antiseptic overlaying the bass notes of human struggle. The light is never truly off, only dimmed, casting a perpetual twilight glow over the silent, heroic dramas unfolding in each curtained bay. It was in this realm of amplified existence that Ilara first became aware of the shadow. It was not a shadow cast by a machine or a passing nurse. It was a presence, a concentration of darkness that seemed to drink the light from around it. It stood at the far end of the central corridor, just beyond the last patient bay, where the hallway turned towards the supply rooms and the staff lounge. It was tall, man-shaped, but devoid of any detail. No face, no features, no suggestion of clothing. It was simply a pillar of absolute blackness, a hole cut in the reality of the dimly lit ward. Her first instinct was rational, a trick of the light, a standing IV pole draped with a black jacket. She blinked, and it was gone. She wrote it off as a symptom of fatigue, the mind painting patterns on the canvas of an exhausted retina. But it returned, not every night, but often enough to become a pattern. She would be charting at the central station, her focus on a patient's vitals, and she would feel it. A subtle drop in temperature, a prickle on the back of her neck. She would look up, and there it would be, motionless, observing. It never approached. It never moved. It simply stood sentinel at the edge of the light. What was most striking was the reaction of the other staff, the ones who had been there for years. They would glance towards it, acknowledge its presence with a slight nod or a quiet sigh, and then return to their work. There was no fear, only a grim acceptance. "Ben," she finally asked during a lull, her voice low. "The thing at the end of the hall, what is it?" Ben didn't need to ask what she meant. He finished labeling a blood sample before he answered. "The Watcher," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Or the Sentinel. We don't really have a name for it, it's just always been here." "But what is it?" "We don't know, and we don't ask." He capped the vial and placed it in the transport bin. "The one rule, the only rule everyone learns on their first day in this ICU is this: you never ever approach it. You never try to communicate with it. You acknowledge it, and you leave it alone. But why? Is it dangerous?" Ben considered this. "Not in the way you think. It's never harmed a patient, never interfered with care. But the stories say that if it ever does move, if it ever leaves its post and approaches a bed, He trailed off, his meaning clearer than any words. The shadow became a part of the ICU's landscape for Ilara, another piece of medical equipment with an unknown function. It was unsettling, but the sheer routine of the horror normalized it. She learned to feel its presence like a change in barometric pressure, a silent weather system in the room. The first time she understood its true nature was during the final hours of Mr. Callahan, a kind, elderly man with end-stage pulmonary fibrosis. He had been a fighter, but his body was losing the long war. His family had just left, tearfully saying their goodbyes. He was DNR. Do not resuscitate. The goal now was comfort. Ilara was adjusting his morphine drip, her hand on his frail arm, speaking to him in a soft, reassuring monotone, even though he was deeply unconscious. The only sounds were the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator and the steady, slow beep of his heart monitor. Then she felt the familiar cold prickle. She looked up. The shadow was no longer at the end of the hall. A wave of ice washed through her veins. She slowly turned her head. It was standing beside Mr. Callahan's bed. It loomed over the patient, its featureless face inclined towards the dying man. It made no sound, emitted no smell. It was simply present. A deeper darkness in the already dim room. Ilara stood frozen, Ben's warning screaming in her mind. You never approach it. But as she watched, something unexpected happened. Mr. Callahan, who had been restless and grimacing in his sedated state, suddenly relaxed. The tight lines of pain around his eyes smoothed away. His breathing, which had been a labored fight against the machine, seemed to synchronize with it, becoming peaceful, accepting. On the monitor, his heart rate, which had been erratic, settled into a strong, steady, and strangely peaceful rhythm. The shadow stood there for perhaps a full minute. Then, without a sound, it was simply gone from the bedside. Ilara's eyes darted to the end of the hall. It was back in its usual place, a silent sentinel once more. 10 minutes later, Mr. Callahan's heart monitor began to sing its final, flatline song. It was not a frantic code, but a quiet surrender. He had passed away without a struggle, without fear. It was one of the most peaceful transitions Ilara had ever witnessed. She understood then. The shadow was not an omen of death. It was an escort. Over the following months, she observed its pattern. It never appeared for every passing. It seemed to choose those whose deaths were particularly arduous, those trapped in a painful, protracted struggle between body and spirit. Its presence did not hasten death, but it seemed to ease the passage, to calm the terror of the final, unknown journey. The patients it attended always died with a profound and inexplicable peace. Driven by a need to comprehend, Ilara again found herself in the archives. The ICU was a newer addition, but the land it was built upon was not. She looked for stories of the old emergency receiving area that had once stood on this spot, for tales of tragedy or a dedicated staff member who had died on duty. She found nothing that fit. It was an old, retired janitor who came in to do special deep cleanings, who provided the missing piece. She found him one afternoon, polishing the floors in the now empty ICU with a slow, rhythmic sweeps of his buffer. "Excuse me," she said, gathering her courage. "I was wondering about the shadow that people see here at night." The old man didn't stop his work, but he smiled a faint, knowing smile. "Ah, you've seen him. You know what it is?" "Not what? Who?" He shut off the buffer, the sudden silence ringing in the large room. This was the site of the old ambulance bay, back before they built the new ER. One night back in the 50s, a young intern was on duty. A real idealist, they say, brilliant but too tender for this world. A bad multi-car wreck came in. He worked for hours trying to save them all. But one by one they slipped away on his table. The last one, a little girl, looked him right in the eyes as she went. He couldn't take it. The weight of all that loss, right in his hands. He walked out to the bay, sat down on the curb and his heart gave out. Not an attack. They said it was like he willed it to stop. The janitor gestured around the pristine high-tech room. They built this place right over where he died. The story goes that he's still on duty, that he can't rest, knowing that people are still fighting that same fight in here. So he stands watch. And when he sees someone who's fought long enough, who's tired and in pain and needs a guide for the last part of the journey, he steps forward. He doesn't take them. He just makes sure they aren't alone when they go. Make sure the path is a little less frightening. The pieces clicked into place for Ilara. The shadow was not a monster. It was the ghost of a healer, a young doctor so burdened by the suffering of others that his own spirit had broken, and in death, that same compassion had become his eternal purpose. He was not haunting the ICU, he was staffing it. A silent colleague in the most difficult specialty of all, the management of the final frontier. From that day on, Ilara's fear of the shadow transformed into a somber respect. When she felt its presence at the end of the hall, she would sometimes give a slight, acknowledging nod. A silent communication between two caregivers on the same difficult shift. She never spoke to it, never approached it, but she understood its mission. The shadow in the ICU was a paradox, a manifestation of a tragic failure that had, in death, become a unique and profound solace. In a place defined by the fierce technological fight against the inevitable, it was a reminder that sometimes the most profound medicine is not a drug or a procedure, but a simple, silent presence in the dark. It was the final, faithful nurse, the last attending physician, ensuring that no one in his ward would ever have to make the journey alone. The morgue was the still point of the hospital's turning world. Located in the sub-basement, down a corridor lit by flickering fluorescence that hummed a low, perpetual note of discontent, it was a place of absolute, unassailable silence. It was a silence that was not peaceful but profound. The quiet of cessation, of processes ended and questions finalized. The air was cold with a mechanical, deliberate chill, smelling of sterilant and a faint metallic undertone that was the signature scent of preserved stillness. For Ilara, whose world was one of constant, monitored vitality, the few times her duties required a trip to the morgue were always a disquieting descent into a different reality. The attendant, a man named Walter who had worked there for 40 years, was as much a part of the atmosphere as the stainless steel drawers. He was a quiet, meticulous man with hands that were always cold, his movements slow and precise, as if not to disturb the peace. He spoke in a hushed tone, not out of reverence, Ilara thought, but out of habit, his voice having adapted to the acoustic demands of the tiled, echo-prone rooms. It was Walter who first mentioned the voices. She was delivering a sheaf of final paperwork for a John Doe, the bureaucratic conclusion to a life that had ended in the ER hours before. Walter took the folder, his fingers brushing against hers, their chill a startling contrast to the living warmth of her hand. "Quiet tonight," he remarked, his eyes scanning the forms. Ilara nodded. "It's always quiet down here." He looked up, his gaze sharp and clear behind his spectacles. "No, I mean quieter than quiet. They're not talking tonight." A prickle, entirely separate from the room's temperature, traced its way down Ilara's spine. "They?" "The guests," Walter said, turning to slide the file into a cabinet. "The ones in the cold rooms. Sometimes they have conversations, low ones, murmurs. You can hear them if you listen at the doors. Not always, just sometimes." He said it with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to comment on the weather. Ilara left quickly, dismissing it as the eccentricity of a man who had spent too long in the company of the dead. But the seed was planted. The next time she had to go down, a week later, she found herself hesitating outside the heavy, insulated door to the main cold chamber. The hallway was empty. Walter was in his office, clacking away on an ancient typewriter. She leaned in, her ear nearly touching the cold steel. At first, there was nothing. Just the hum of the refrigeration units, a deep, vibrational thrum that she felt in her bones. Then, she heard it. Not words. Not at first. It was the shape of a conversation, a low, rhythmic murmur, like two people speaking softly in another room, the cadence of question and answer, of statement and reply. The voices had no gender, no age, no discernible accent. They were simply voices, a susurrus of sound woven into the mechanical hum. She pulled back, her heart hammering. It was there. It was real. Over the following months, her trips to the morgue, though infrequent, became exercises in focused listening. She learned the patterns. The conversations were never loud, never angry or distressed. They were calm, meandering, like the discussions of old friends catching up after a long separation. Sometimes they would fall silent for weeks. Other times she would hear them clearly, a soft, overlapping dialogue from behind the sealed door. The most profound experience, however, was not a sound she heard, but one she was seemingly meant to answer. It was during the dead of winter, a night so cold that the wind howled around the hospital like a bereaved animal. The hospital was full, the air thick with the flu and pneumonia. Death was busy. Ilara was delivering the final belongings of a patient to the morgue's lockup, a simple task that felt unbearably heavy. The patient had been a young woman, a musician. The sub-basement was colder than usual. Walter was gone for the night, and the silence felt deeper, more absolute. As she approached the cold room door to place the tag on the log clipboard, she heard it. Not a murmur this time. A single, clear and utterly distinct word whispered from directly behind the door. "Hello?" The voice was faint, thin, as if coming from a great distance, but the enunciation was perfect. It was a question, plaintive and hopeful. Ilara froze, her hand outstretched, the tag fluttering between her fingers. Every instinct told her to run, to flee back to the world of the living, of beeping monitors and warm skin. But the voice held no malice. It was simply a voice, a soul reaching out from the silence. Ben's rule from the ICU echoed in her mind. You never approach it. But this was different. This was a direct address. Hesitantly, her own voice a trembling breath in the frigid air, she answered. "Hello?" There was a long pause. The humming of the unit seemed to grow louder. Then, the voice came again, clearer now, tinged with a note of wonder. "You can hear me?" "Yes," Ilara whispered, her forehead now pressed against the cold steel of the door. "I can hear you." A soft sigh, a sound of profound relief echoed from within. "It's so quiet here. It's nice to finally talk." "Who are you?" she asked. "I'm not sure. It's hard to remember. It's all faded. But I remember the music. I always remember the music." The young woman. The musician. Ilara's eyes stung. "You played the violin." A sense of joyful recognition flowed through the door, a warmth in the cold. Yes, I did. Do you know if anyone found my composition? The one in the blue notebook?" Ilara thought of the patient's grieving parents, of the box of sheet music they had taken home. "I think they did. I think they have it." The voice was silent for a moment, and when it spoke again, it was filled with a peace that was almost tangible. "Good. That's good. Thank you for telling me, and for talking." "You're welcome," Ilara said, her own tears now freezing on her cheeks. "It's time for me to go now," the voice whispered, growing fainter. "The quiet is calling, but it doesn't feel so lonely anymore. Thank you." And then it was gone. The conversational murmur did not resume. The morgue returned to its absolute, profound silence. But it felt different now. The silence was no longer empty. It was simply resting. When she saw Walter the next day, she didn't tell him what had happened, but he looked at her, his old eyes knowing. "You heard one, didn't you?" he said. Not a question, but a statement. She just nodded. He sighed, a puff of condensation in the cold air. "It happens. Not often. They're not trapped, you know. Not in the way you think. They're just lingering, processing. The transition from something to nothing is a big one. Sometimes they just need a moment to adjust, to say a last thing, to ask a final question, to make sure they won't be entirely forgotten the moment they cross the threshold. That conversation you hear, it's them talking to each other, sharing their stories one last time before they let go." He gestured to the cold room door. "That's not a tomb. It's a waiting room. And sometimes, very rarely, one of them needs a little help from our side to find their ticket." Elara never initiated another conversation, but her fear of the morgue was gone, replaced by a deep and solemn respect. She understood now. The quiet conversations were not the sounds of haunting, but of release. It was the sound of souls in their final moments of attachment to this world, forming a brief, compassionate community in the cold and the dark, offering each other comfort on the journey into the great final silence. And in that, it was perhaps one of the most human places in the entire hospital. In the hierarchy of hospital smells, there was the crisp, clean scent of fresh linens, the astringent bite of isopropyl alcohol, the faint sugary aroma of nutritional supplements, and the underlying metallic tang of fear and antiseptic that was the baseline of the place. But in the old chemistry lab, tucked away on the third floor of the East Wing, there was a smell that belonged to none of these categories. It was the smell of formaldehyde. The lab itself was largely obsolete. Modern diagnostic testing had been consolidated into a gleaming, automated facility in the new wing. This place was now a relic, used for storage of outdated equipment and the occasional training session. Its shelves were lined with dusty glass beakers, graduated cylinders and microscopes whose lenses were flecked with age. The counters were formica, their surfaces stained by long evaporated chemicals. But it was the smell that defined the room. It was a pungent, preservative odor, sweetly chemical and profoundly unsettling, the smell of dissection and permanent fixation. Elara's first encounter with it was on a night when she was searching for a box of old patient education pamphlets that had been mistakenly sent there. She pushed the heavy door open, and the wave of scent hit her like a physical force. It was so strong, so concentrated, it made her eyes water and her throat constrict. It was as if a vat of the chemical had just been spilled. She flicked on the lights. The fluorescent bars overhead buzzed and flickered to life, illuminating an empty, silent room. There were no open containers, no recent spills. The air was still, yet the smell persisted, a ghost in the air itself. She found the pamphlets quickly and left, the scent clinging to her clothes and hair for hours afterward. When she mentioned it to Ben, he simply nodded. "Ah, you found Dr. Albright's lab," he said. Dr. Albright, a research chemist, worked here back in the 60s and 70s. A genius by all accounts, but eccentric. Obsessed with cellular preservation, with halting the process of decay. He believed he could perfect a formula that would allow tissue to live indefinitely outside the body. He spent decades in that lab, working alone, night after night. "What happened to him?" Elara asked, though she already sensed the answer. "He was found one morning at his bench," Ben said, his voice dropping. "A massive cerebral hemorrhage. They said he'd been dead for hours. But the strangest part, the part that became the story, was that there was no smell. None. Despite the open beakers and the chemicals he'd been working with, the room smelled only of his death. The formaldehyde, they said, had simply vanished from the air. And now it's back. Now it's back, Ben confirmed, but only sometimes, and only at night. They say he's still trying to finish his work, that when the scent is strong, he's close to a breakthrough, and when it fades, he's failed again. From then on, Ilara was acutely aware of the lab. She would sometimes take the long way around just to pass its door. Some nights, the hallway outside was normal. Other nights, the scent would seep from under the door, a silent, chemical announcement of his presence. The second phenomenon was more subtle. It was reported by the night cleaning crew. They would sometimes enter the lab in the early morning hours to find the glassware slightly out of place. A beaker that had been on the left side of a shelf would be on the right. A stirring rod would be lying on the counter when it had been put away. It was never a mess, never vandalism. It was as if the items had been used, carefully cleaned, and then returned to almost, but not quite, their original positions. Then came the night of the beakers. Ilara was responding to a call from security. A motion sensor in the old East Wing had been triggered, specifically in the corridor outside the chemistry lab. It was her turn to accompany the guard on the check. They walked the quiet halls, their footsteps echoing, the guard's flashlight beam cutting a swath through the dimness. As they approached the lab, the smell of formaldehyde was overpowering. It was thicker than ever before, a palpable fog of it. The security guard, a young man named Rico, wrinkled his nose. "Geez, what is that?" "History," Ilara murmured. He keyed in the code and pushed the door open, shining his light inside. The lab was not as they had left it. On the central counter, arranged with meticulous precision, were a dozen glass beakers. They were filled with clear liquid, and in each, suspended as if by magic, was a different object. A feather, a dead moth, a single vibrant autumn leaf, a rosebud, perfectly preserved. In the largest beaker at the center of the arrangement floated a small, white laboratory mouse. Its eyes were closed, and it looked peaceful, as if sleeping in its chemical womb. Every specimen was perfectly intact, not decaying, but held in a state of flawless suspension. There was no one in the room. The windows were locked. The only door was the one they had just come through. Rico radioed it in, his voice shaky. "False alarm. Probably just a prank by someone with a really weird sense of humor." But Ilara knew it wasn't a prank. This was a demonstration, a progress report. Dr. Albright was showing them that he was succeeding. Driven by a compulsion she didn't fully understand, she began to spend some of her breaks sitting on a bench in the hallway outside the lab. She didn't go in. She simply sat in the presence of the phenomenon. She would read a book or chart, all while the faint, sweet rotten scent of formaldehyde filled the air around her. It was a vigil, a silent companionship. One night, as she sat there, the scent suddenly intensified, becoming almost suffocating. Then, just as suddenly, it vanished, leaving behind only the neutral, dusty smell of the old wing. From under the door, a single piece of paper slid out, skittering across the linoleum to come to rest against her shoe. It was a sheet of lab stationery, yellowed with age. On it, in a precise, spidery cursive, was a single sentence. "The leaf retains its color, but the tree is gone. Is this life, or merely a refusal to decay?" There was no signature, but she knew who it was from. It was not a cry for help, nor a boast of achievement. It was a philosophical question from a mind trapped between worlds, still grappling with the fundamental problem that had consumed his life. Ilara picked up the note. She went to the lab door and spoke softly to the wood. "It's a record," she whispered. "A memory made physical. That's all any of us are in the end." There was no response. No returning scent. No sliding paper, but she felt a shift in the silence, a sense of consideration. She took the note to the archives. It wasn't difficult to find Dr. Albright's records. He had published several papers, all on topics of cellular fixation and preservation. He had been a lone voice, his theories considered fringe even then. In a personnel file, she found a photograph. He was a thin, severe-looking man with sharp eyes behind thick glasses, standing proudly in his lab, the very same lab. After that night, the phenomena changed. The overpowering scent of formaldehyde became rare. The beakers were never again found arranged in displays, but the cleaning crew still occasionally reported items being slightly moved, and sometimes, very rarely, a nurse or an aide working a lonely night shift would find a single perfect flower, a lily, an orchid, left on their station counter. It would be dewy fresh, impossibly vibrant, and would remain so for days without wilting, without water, as if held in a single perfect moment in time. Elara understood. Dr. Albright had not found the secret to eternal life, but he had, in his own way, mastered the art of the beautiful pause. He was no longer trying to conquer death for humanity, but to create small, perfect pockets of preservation, gifts of enduring beauty for the living who still moved through time. The phantom scent in the chem lab was not the smell of death or failure. It was the scent of a relentless, eternal curiosity. It was the aroma of a question that had outlived the questioner, still hanging in the air, waiting for an answer that would never come. And in a way, his endless, ghostly experimentation had become its own strange form of life. A persistent, intellectual presence that refused to decay. A mind forever preserved in the act of asking, what if? In the sanctified hierarchy of hospital spaces, the operating room holds a unique and solemn position. It is a theater of absolute precision, a realm where the very air is filtered and counted, where light is measured in lumens of sterile whiteness, and where silence is a protocol, broken only by the low murmur of focused intent and the definitive clack of steel on steel. Or four, one of the older theaters in the original surgical wing, was such a place. It was a room of tiled walls and poured floors, its equipment a mix of modern marvels and stubborn, reliable antiques. And it was, by all accounts, haunted. But its haunting was not one of apparitions or cold spots. It was a haunting of procedure. Ilara's introduction to it came via a frantic page from a young surgical resident named Dr. Miles. His text was a masterpiece of professional understatement and personal panic. Need you at OR4. Unscheduled. Prep. Can't explain. Please come. When she arrived, the corridor outside the operating theater was empty. The lights dimmed for the night. But the small circular window set into the door of OR4 glowed with the full, brutal intensity of its surgical lights. She pushed the door open, the silent pneumatic hiss feeling abnormally loud. The room was spotless, silent, and prepared for surgery. The central table was draped in sterile blue linens. The large, multi-armed surgical light was angled perfectly over it. On a stainless steel instrument tray beside the table, an array of tools was laid out with fastidious, almost ceremonial care. Scalpels, retractors, clamps, and forceps all gleamed under the light, arranged not by function but by some unknown, specific sequence. It was a setup for a procedure, but one that made no anatomical sense. The tools were for both deep internal work and superficial closure, a jumbled repertoire from different surgical specialties. Dr. Miles was standing frozen by the scrub sink, his face pale. I was doing my rounds, he stammered, not taking his eyes off the table. The light was on. I thought maintenance was in. I came in to turn it off and it was like this. Was the door locked? Ilara asked, her own voice hushed in the face of this sterile, silent tableau. Always I had to use my key. He finally looked at her, his eyes wide with a confusion that bordered on fear. Nurse, I didn't do this. And there's no case on the board for this room, not for tonight, not for tomorrow. As they watched, the air in the room grew cold. Not the controlled, air-conditioned chill of the climate control, but a deep, invasive cold that seeped into the bones. And with the cold came a smell, faint but unmistakable. The sweet, cloying scent of chloroform, layered over the sharper aroma of old-fashioned antiseptic, something like iodine and carbolic acid. Then they saw them. They were not solid figures but suggestions, impressions of movement cast upon the air itself, like heat haze over asphalt. There were 3 of them, gathered around the table. One, tall and commanding, stood at the head, where the anesthesiologist would be. The other 2 flanked the table, their hands mere shimmering outlines, hovering over the arranged instruments. They were dressed in the antiquated surgical garb of a century past. Long, blood-stained coats, not the sterile blue paper of today. Ilara and Dr. Miles stood transfixed as the spectral show began to unfold. The shimmering figure at the head of the table mimed the administration of an anesthetic from a non-existent mask. The 2 figures at the sides reached for the instruments. Their movements were swift, confident, and utterly silent. A scalpel was lifted, its ghostly edge making an incision in the empty air above the draped table. Retractors were placed, holding open an invisible wound. Their hands moved in a blur of silent, desperate activity. It was a pantomime of immense skill and profound urgency. They were trying to save someone. Their focused intensity was palpable, a psychic residue of a long-ago crisis. The figure acting as surgeon would occasionally look up, its featureless face turning towards the anesthesiologist, a silent, frantic question in its posture. The response was always a slow, grim shake of the head. "They're losing him," Dr. Miles whispered, his medical training overriding his terror, diagnosing the scene before him. The silent operation continued for several minutes, a ballet of despair performed on a vacant stage. Then, all at once, the spectral figures froze. The surgeon's hands, holding a ghostly clamp, stopped mid-movement. The anesthesiologist lowered its head. The other assistant let its instrument drop back to the tray with a soundless clatter. A wave of profound failure washed through the room, a sorrow so heavy it felt like a physical weight. The cold intensified, and the smell of chloroform became suffocating. Then the figures simply faded, dissipating like smoke in the bright, sterile light. The operating room was just a room again. The instruments still lay on the tray, but their eerie, purposeful arrangement now seemed just like a random, bizarre occurrence. The lights, however, remained blazing. Dr. Miles let out a shaky breath. What in God's name was that? "An echo," Ilara said, her own heart still thrumming. "A memory the room can't forget." Driven to understand, Ilara returned to the archives the next day. She searched for records of OR4, for any tragic incidents. The room had been part of the original hospital, opened in 1912. She combed through old surgical logs, her eyes straining at the faded ink and fountain pen script. She found it on a log sheet from December 19, 1918. The patient was a city councilman, a man named Alistair Finch. The procedure was an emergency appendectomy. The surgeon was a Dr. Joseph Wickham, renowned for his speed and skill. The notes were terse. Procedure commenced 23. Patient exhibited unexpected respiratory distress under chloroform. Attempts to resuscitate unsuccessful. Patient expired on table 23:47. A handwritten addendum, scrawled in the margin by a different hand, provided the chilling detail. Dr. Wickham insisted the procedure continue, hoping to relieve pressure. Instruments were laid for both the appendectomy and a potential thoracotomy. The team worked in vain for nearly an hour after cardiac arrest. Dr. Wickham was heard to say, "The tools are here. The will is here. Why is the life gone?" Ilara understood. The haunting of OR4 was not the ghost of the councilman who had died. It was the ghost of the surgical team's failure. It was the enduring echo of their skill, their preparation, their desperate, futile effort. They were trapped in the moment their expertise met its absolute limit. The room prepared itself because they were forever preparing for a surgery that was already lost, forever hoping that this time, with the instruments laid just so, the outcome would be different. After that, Ilara made it a point to occasionally check OR4 on her rounds. Some nights, it was dark and silent, but on others, the light would be on, and through the window, she would see the instruments laid out on the tray in that same nonsensical, urgent order. She never entered on those nights. She would simply stand at the window for a moment, a silent observer to a century-old tragedy. She would nod, a small, respectful acknowledgement to the 3 dedicated surgeons who were still, and would always be, trying to save their patient. Then she would turn away, leaving them to their endless, silent, and perfectly prepared vigil. The operating room that prepared itself was not a place of malevolence, but a monument to professional devotion so absolute that not even death could make it stand down. The mother and baby unit was, by design, the most joyful place in the entire hospital. It was a world of soft pinks and blues, of congratulatory cards and the quiet, awe-filled chatter of new families. The air carried the sweet, milky scent of newborns and the faint, clean aroma of baby shampoo. It was a place of beginnings, of first breaths and first cries, a sanctuary designed to cushion the profound shock of entering the world. But like all places of intense emotion, its foundations ran deep, and not all the echoes trapped within its walls were happy ones. Ilara was covering a few shifts there, helping with the overnight checks on newborns. The unit was quiet, bathed in the soft, dim glow of nightlights. The only sounds were the gentle rustle of a nurse at the central station, the occasional mewling cry of a hungry infant quickly soothed, and the rhythmic hum of the climate control. It was during the deepest part of the night, in the hour just before the dawn began to bleed into the sky, that she first heard it. It was a lullaby. The voice was a woman's, faint and distant, as if drifting from the end of a long hallway or through a closed door. It was not sung in English, but in a language Ilara didn't recognize, something soft and flowing, with gentle rocking cadences. The melody was ancient and profoundly sad, a minor key lament that seemed to hold the weight of centuries of mothers soothing their children. It was beautiful, but its beauty was of the kind that aches, that speaks of love and loss in the same breath. She straightened up from the bassinet she was checking, her head tilted. "Do you hear that?" she whispered to the charge nurse, a capable, no-nonsense woman named Brenda. Brenda didn't look up from her charting. "The lullaby? Yeah. You get used to it." "What is it?" "No one knows." "It's been here longer than I have," Brenda said, her tone pragmatic. "It's always around 4 a.m. Comes from the old recovery room at the end of the hall, the one we use for storage now. Doesn't hurt anything. Some of the babies, the fussy ones, they actually settle down when it starts. It's helpful." Ilara found this both comforting and unsettling. A ghostly lullaby that soothed newborns was preferable to a poltergeist, but the profound sorrow woven into the melody haunted her. Over the next few nights, she made a point of being near that storage room when 4 a.m. approached, and like clockwork, the singing would begin. She would press her ear to the cold wood of the door, and the sound would be slightly clearer, the woman's voice trembling with a tender, heartbreaking emotion. She noticed the effect on the babies, just as Brenda had said. A little boy named Noah, who had been fractious with gas, would still his flailing limbs, his eyes growing heavy. A premature little girl, whose monitors were a constant source of anxiety, would see her heart rate stabilize into a calm, steady rhythm as the song floated through the unit. The lullaby was a balm, a spectral comfort. The phenomenon took a more tangible turn a week later. A young, first-time mother named Chloe was struggling. Her baby, a girl named Isabella, was colicky and would cry for hours, despite all efforts to console her. Exhausted and tearful, Chloe had finally settled into a rocking chair in her room, desperately trying to rock her screaming daughter to sleep. Ilara was about to step in to relieve her when the lullaby began. As the faint melodic strains filtered into the room, something remarkable happened. Isabella's frantic cries hitched, then softened into whimpers. Her tiny, tense body relaxed. Chloe, sensing the change, looked up, her eyes wide with wonder and confusion. She continued to rock, but now the motion was synchronized with the slow, rhythmic pace of the unseen song. Ilara watched from the doorway as Chloe's own exhaustion seemed to lift, replaced by a wave of calm. She began to hum along, instinctively finding the melody, her voice blending with the spectral one. Mother and ghost, together, soothed the child. Within minutes, Isabella was asleep, her chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. Chloe looked toward the door, her eyes meeting Ilara's, and she smiled, a tear of relief tracing a path down her cheek. "It's like an angel was helping me," she whispered. Driven to find the source of this sorrowful angel, Ilara returned to the archives. The mother and baby unit was a newer construction, but it was built within the shell of the old maternity ward. She searched for records of tragedy, for a mother or a child lost. She found many, as was the grim reality of a bygone era, but none that felt connected to the lullaby. It was an old retired obstetrician, Dr. Rosenthal, who came in for a fundraising gala, who provided the key. Ilara, helping to direct guests, recognized his name from some of the older plaques in the hospital. She gathered her courage and approached him, asking if he had ever heard stories of a lullaby in the old maternity ward. The old doctor's eyes grew distant. "Ah," he said softly, "you've heard Anna's song." "Anna?" "Anna Petran. She was a refugee displaced by the war in Europe. She came here alone, pregnant, speaking no English. She was taken in by a charity and brought to this hospital to give birth. It was a difficult labor. The child, a boy, was born healthy. But Anna, she had a hidden heart condition. We didn't know. She held her son just once, sang him that lullaby, a folk song from her village, she told the nurse. Then she closed her eyes and slipped away." He sighed, the memory heavy upon him. "The tragedy was, there was no family to claim the baby. He was placed in the system. We never knew what became of him. But the nurses on the ward, they said that for nights afterward they could hear her singing, that she was still here, waiting for someone to come for her son, still singing him to sleep." Ilara's heart broke for the lonely woman, forever separated from the child she had held for only a moment. She's not waiting anymore, Ilara realized aloud. She's not singing for her own son. She's singing for all of them. Dr. Rosenthal nodded. "That is what I have come to believe. Her love was so powerful, so focused on that one act of motherhood, that it could not be contained by death. It overflowed. It attached itself not to a person, but to the act of comforting a child. That night, when the lullaby began, Ilara did not simply listen. She walked to the storage room, the source of the sound. She didn't try to open the door. Instead, she stood before it, her hands resting on the frame. "Thank you, Anna," she whispered into the wood. "Your son was loved if only for a moment, and now you love so many. You can rest. He is at peace, and you have become a mother to every child who needs comfort here." The singing did not stop, but for a single crystalline moment. And so we arrive at the end of our walk through these silent moonlit halls. We've listened to the echoes that refuse to fade and glimpsed the shadows that stand where students once did. These stories remind us that buildings, especially those filled with the intense emotions of youth, can become repositories for moments that time has not erased. They are quiet, persistent reminders that the past is never as distant as it seems. You too carry the echoes of your own school days within you, the anxieties, the triumphs, the friendships, and as you rest, The world of waking certainty softens, allowing the boundary between then and now to gently blur. If you found calm in this quiet journey, or if sleep has already begun to wash over you, know that this too is part of finding peace. If you enjoyed this journey, you might consider subscribing or leaving a quiet thought in the comments below. It helps more wandering minds find their way here, one sleepy soul at a time. Now, good night.